Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. It sounds like Sherrone Moore, this Michigan program, not done quite yet in the transfer portal, as we've seen a couple of Notre Dame offensive linemen hit the transfer portal over the last couple of days, and it sounds like two of which Michigan might have interest in adding going into 2025. Obviously, headlined by Rocco Spindler, a very popular name for us Michigan fans who follow the recruiting trail pretty closely. Former top 100 prospect, was from Michigan. A lot of people thought he was going to come to Michigan, ends up going to Notre Dame. The other one being Pat Coogan. I think the two conversations that we have to have as Michigan fans, number one, let's get to know these two players, talk about what they could bring to this Michigan offensive line. But I think secondly, is it worth Michigan going after these two guys? And look, I'm never going to get up on a table and tell Sherrone Moore what to do on the offensive line, one of the best in the business. But when you talk about how to manage the transfer portal, there's going to be a lot of names that you might want to take a look at, but maybe aren't necessarily the best fit. And you're going to do your due diligence, but maybe not go after them all that hard. That's the conversation that I want to have is, hey, we like these two players. I don't think any Michigan fans are going to be upset about adding depth and veteran experience on the offensive line, but does it make sense for Michigan? That's the conversation I want to get into before we do. And as always, the Michigan fans, one, let it fly in the comments section. My brother and I had this conversation late last night when we got the news that Michigan was going to be looking at these two. We didn't necessarily disagree or agree on it. I'm sure many Michigan fans are kind of a split decision as well. Let it fly in the comment section. I think that's the beauty of having this conversation. Appreciate the Michigan fans and all the support y'all have shown the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with the most notable name here, and that's Rocco Spindler. And you look at Rocco and say it's probably fair to say it's been a little bit of a roller coaster ride for Rocco at Notre Dame. Made 20 starts, and that's something that I think's important. You know, one of the things that I think got Michigan in a little bit of hot water with is, look, we had guys like Greg Crippen and guys like Giovanni El-Hadi, guys that have been around the Michigan program for a while, but didn't necessarily have a ton of starting experience. A guy like Rocco Spindler, I mean, he has 20 starts under his belt. Now, has it been perfect for him during the last couple of years at Notre Dame? No, but he's coming off a pretty dang solid season in 2024. 0 sacks given up, only 7 quarterback pressures, 299 pass for opportunities. He's a big, physically imposing offensive lineman that I love coming out of high school. Right, one, he certainly looked the part. Secondly, he had a wrestling background. I personally just love line of scrimmage players with that wrestling background. I look at Rocco and say there's probably some upside there that I think would be interesting for Michigan fans to take a look at. Now, the second one, Pat Coogan, who has what the thing you like about Pat Coogan is experience starting at multiple spots. You know, he started 10 games for Notre Dame at center this year. Keep in mind, a Notre Dame team that played for a national championship, made 12 starts at guard last year. I mean, in 2024, 0 sacks, only 5 quarterback pressures on over 300 pass per opportunities. Both Rocco Spindler and Pat Coogan, the way I look at it, are very solid power 4 offensive linemen. Now the conversation is, does it make sense for Michigan to go after these two guys? And I think there's probably 3 different conversations that you have to ask. And I think it helps to pull in the depth chart to have this conversation, right? Number one, is this a player you can't say no to? Right. You look at Justice Haynes. Did Michigan desperately need a running back? No, probably not, especially with what we saw from Jordan Marshall in that bowl game against Alabama. I think a lot of Michigan fans would have been quite comfortable rocking with Jordan Marshall as our running back 1 heading into the 2025 year, having guys like Ben Hall kind of rounding out the depth. But you look at Justice Haynes and say that's a guy that you don't want to say no to if you have the opportunity to bring him in. And so are these two players guys that you just can't say no to? They're too good to kind of ignore? I would probably say not. You know, I think they're solid power 4 starting caliber offensive linemen. Are they guys that are going to be All-Americans for you in 2025? No, probably not. Then the second question is it a position of need? And that probably depends on how you feel about some of the depth Michigan has, right? You return Greg Crippen. You return Giovanni Elhadi, both of which maybe struggled a little bit early in 2024, but both of which I thought got better going into the back half of 2024, you might say. And so if you were to ask me, do you feel comfortable going into 2025 with Greg Pippen and a guy like Giovanni Elhadi? I'll answer yes. And the second question is, what do you feel about the depth and maybe some of the other guards, right? Nathan Afobe, a guy that I personally really do liked him out of high school, liked what we've seen from him in the spring games, but don't necessarily know if he's a proven commodity on the inside of the offensive line. You have Jake Winera, who looked very good as an early enrollee freshman in last year's spring game. You have a guy like Luke Hamilton, who we like coming out of high school. And then you have a guy in Lawrence Attar, who will not be, I believe, with the program in spring, will be enrolling in the summer. Obviously, a Division II All-American, but we all know that's a really big jump from Division II to big time football, and you kind of want to get a feel for it. How does he look going up against guys like Trey Pierce and Rayshawn Benny before you feel comfortable about him being in the two deep? I look at it and say, I wouldn't mind as a Michigan fan adding at least one of these in. And my preference probably would be Pat Coogan over Rocco for a couple of different reasons. One, Pat Coogan has experience both at center and guard, so you can bring him in and he can be in the two deep both at center if anything happens to Greg Crippen, or if he beats him out, or he can be in the two deep at the guard spot, or just plug in and play left guard over a guy like Nathan Afobe. To me, that position versatility, I look at Pat Coogan and say, yeah, that probably would make some sense. Now, is it a clear upgrade is probably the third question. I would probably say no. I don't think Rocco Spindler or Pat Coogan are clearly upgrading guys like Greg Crippen or Giovanni Elhadi. And if I have the choice between rocking with guys who committed to Michigan out of high school and have been with this program, or adding a transfer portal addition, I'd take the guy that's been within this program and committed to Michigan out of high school every single day of the week. And so you look at these two names, and my final take might be this. I wouldn't say no to either of these guys. You can never have enough depth and competition and experience on the offensive line. I always go back to Michigan making that run in 2023 when, Michigan deals with some injuries on the offensive line and you have to kind of change it around a little bit. You kick Carson Barnhart. This is when Zach Zinner got hurt. Carson Barnhart goes into guard. Trente Jones goes into tackle. And you never really saw Michigan skip a beat. That would wreck a lot of other programs. It didn't really wreck Michigan because we had that depth and continuity. So you'd never say no to starting caliber offensive linemen. I think the question a little bit more is it worth the resources? Because I look at some other positions at Michigan, most notably that wide receiver spot, and say, if we had the choice between pushing our resources and bringing in a guy like Pat or Rocco, or bringing in a guy in the spring portal window at wide receiver, I think a lot of Michigan fans would take the addition at wide receiver. And so that's a conversation I think Sherrone Moore probably needs to have with Sean Maggie and some other coaches on that staff, and saying, hey, is it worth it as a position of need? Do we feel like these guys can come in and play a role for us? Because if not, you don't want to just add guys to add guys, because you probably want to keep some resources free for when that spring transfer portal window hits and you see some other quality players hit the portal that might be bigger needs for your roster. You want to make sure you're ready in that spot as well. And so my take is, look, we'll break it down. If either Pat Coogan or Rocco end up coming to Michigan, isn't necessarily a must get for Michigan right now. I'd probably say no. We'll see how it shakes out. Again, never saying no to a guy like Rocco or Pat who have starting experience on a national championship caliber roster that we saw for Notre Dame. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. We'll see how it plays out. It sounds like Michigan is probably close to being done in the transfer portal for this window. We're going to ramp up those conversations after spring practice, but we're going to get into what Michigan's doing on the recruiting trail in 2026, where it seems to be Michigan's getting active. And then secondly, we'll talk about some of these spring practice storylines, of which there are plenty, including Bryce Underwood. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.